It was a quiet, peaceful afternoon in the small town of Brooksville, nestled in the rolling hills of rural America. Emma stood at the edge of the park, watching her two children, Jack and Lily, chase each other around the playground. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows on the freshly cut grass. Emma was a single mother, working tirelessly as a nurse at the local hospital. Her days were long and exhausting, but she always made time for her kids. They were her world, and this moment, watching them laugh and play, was her sanctuary. The park, though small and quaint, was the heart of the town's community, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries, children ran free, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. For Emma, it was a rare chance to catch her breath after a long shift. She was used to the weight of the world on her shoulders, juggling work, motherhood, and the daily grind, but here in the park, in these moments, she felt normal again. As she leaned against the metal fence, Emma took a deep breath and felt the tension in her shoulders ease. It was the kind of day she cherished, a perfect, quiet escape from the chaos of life. But in the distance, a figure approached, a tall man in a dark sheriff's uniform. His boots thudded against the gravel as he walked toward the playground. It was Sheriff Martin, a man who had been the law in Brooksville for as long as Emma could remember. Most people respected him, his reputation built on a no-nonsense, tough-as-nails persona. Some said he was firm but fair. Others whispered about his harshness and occasional heavy-handedness when dealing with certain people. Emma had never crossed paths with him much before today, but she'd heard enough from neighbors to know that his authority had a dark edge, one that made her uneasy. Sheriff Martin was known for his no-tolerance approach, and though his job was to serve and protect, there were whispers in town about his biases. Emma had heard the rumors but kept her distance, trying not to get caught up in the small-town gossip. She tried to stay neutral, focusing on her own life and her children. But today, she could feel that something in the air was different. As the sheriff neared the playground, his eyes scanned the area, briefly settling on Emma. His gaze lingered a moment too long, and Emma felt a tightness in her chest. She shifted uncomfortably, but didn't move. The last thing she wanted was to make a scene. Jack and Lily, oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, continued their game, laughing and shrieking as they ran circles around each other. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that today wouldn't be as peaceful as she had hoped. Sheriff Martin stopped a few yards away from Emma, his hands resting on his belt. He stood tall, towering over her, with an air of authority that made the air around them feel heavy. His voice was gruff as he spoke, his words carrying a tone of command. "Ma'am, could you ask your kids to quiet down a bit? They're disturbing the peace." Emma blinked, confused. Her children were playing, yes, but they weren't causing any real disruption. There was no loud music, no chaos, just innocent play. "Excuse me, Sheriff," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're just kids, and it's a park. They're not bothering anyone." Sheriff Martin's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his tone turning colder. "I don't need to explain myself to you, ma'am. Just get them under control, or I'll have to take action." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was something about the way he spoke, like he was accustomed to people backing down, like his authority was beyond reproach. She stood her ground. "I'm not asking them to stop playing. They're just having fun. There's no reason to get upset over something so small." Martin's jaw clenched. "I said, quiet them down," he repeated, his voice more insistent now, almost a growl. "Or I'll have no choice but to take further action." The tension between them escalated quickly. Emma could feel her heart rate rising, her palms beginning to sweat. She knew she had to stay calm. But something about the sheriff's aggressive stance, the way he treated her like an inconvenience, ignited a spark of defiance inside her. She wasn't about to let him bully her or her kids. Not here. Not today. "Sheriff," she said, her voice firm, "I'm not doing anything wrong. My kids are just playing. If you have an issue with that, you should take it up with someone else. We don't need any trouble." His eyes flashed with irritation, and he stepped forward again, blocking her view of her children. His presence was imposing, and Emma felt trapped. "You're going to have to listen to me, Mom," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I can arrest you for resisting." At that moment, Emma's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. Her children, sensing the change in the air, stopped playing and turned to look at her. Jack's face showed concern, his young eyes wide with confusion. Lily, the older of the two, took a step closer to her mom, sensing the rising tension in the air. Emma's heart tightened in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them. "Look, Sheriff," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not causing any trouble. Just let us be." Her mind raced as she weighed her options. She could walk away and avoid further conflict, or she could stand her ground. But if she did that, there was a real chance the situation could spiral into something far worse. The sheriff's gaze hardened. "You don't want to make this harder on yourself," he warned, his words dripping with menace. His hand hovered near his belt, where the handle of his gun was just visible. It was an unspoken threat, one that Emma could feel hanging over her like a dark cloud. Everything inside her told her to back down, to avoid making a scene, to do whatever it took to protect her children. But she couldn't just let this man push her around. Not in front of her kids, not in front of anyone. "Let's go, kids," Emma said, her voice sharp as she reached for their hands. But before she could take a step, the sheriff moved quickly, blocking her path. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. The world seemed to freeze around Emma. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the gravity of the moment. She wasn't just standing up to a man. She was standing up to authority, to power that had been unchecked for far too long. And in that instant, Emma knew her life was about to change forever. As she looked into the sheriff's eyes, her fear turned into resolve. She would not be intimidated. She would not back down. Not today. Not in front of her children. Not in front of anyone. The choices she made in the next few moments would alter the course of her life, and the life of the community, forever. Emma's breath quickened as Sheriff Martin blocked her path, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her and her children. The tension in the air was palpable, suffocating. She felt the weight of the situation press down on her chest, but she refused to let fear take hold. Her instincts told her to stay calm, but every nerve in her body screamed to run. She glanced down at Jack and Lily, their wide eyes filled with confusion and concern. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them too. Sheriff Martin's posture was rigid, his hand still hovering near his gun. The threat was unmistakable, but Emma had been in situations before where she had to hold her ground, where she had to stay calm under pressure. But this wasn't a typical confrontation. This man, this sheriff, was someone with power, someone used to getting his way. And right now, he was using that power to intimidate her. Emma clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the urge to back down. She knew that if she did, her children would see her give in, and that wasn't the kind of lesson she wanted to teach them. "You can't just threaten me like this," Emma said, her voice trembling but firm. She was fighting to hold on to her composure, but her words held weight. "This isn't right. You're bullying me, and it needs to stop." Sheriff Martin's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't want to test me, lady. I'm just trying to keep the peace, but you're making it real hard. I could make things difficult for you." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. She was no stranger to adversity. She had faced challenges all her life, and this moment, though terrifying, wasn't going to break her. She took a deep breath, her voice steadying. "What are you going to do, Sheriff? Arrest me for speaking up? For standing here with my kids?" The sheriff's hand moved slightly toward his gun, his posture stiffening as if he were preparing for something. Emma's eyes flicked to the children, Jack and Lily, who were now gripping her sides, sensing the danger in the air. Jack's lower lip quivered as he looked up at her, but Emma gave him a reassuring smile, though it barely reached her eyes. She had to stay strong for them. "I said quiet them down. Now," Sheriff Martin barked, taking a step forward, his finger brushing against the grip of his holster. The threat was clear. Emma could feel the blood rush to her face, anger bubbling up from deep within. She had never been one to back down, but the fear was there. There was no denying it. Not for herself, but for her kids. What if things went too far? What if he did something that couldn't be undone? But then she remembered what was at stake. She wasn't just a victim of this situation. She was their mother, their protector. She couldn't let this man intimidate her. Not in front of her children. Not in front of anyone. Her mind raced. She had to do something. But what? The sheriff's actions were escalating by the second, his words sharper now, dripping with a sense of power. Emma's heart thudded in her ears, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she had an idea. In one swift motion, Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't hesitate. She aimed it at the sheriff, her fingers quickly pressing the record button. Sheriff Martin's eyes flicked to her phone, and his expression twisted into one of fury. "You think you can just record me?" He spat. "You're making a big mistake." But Emma didn't flinch. "I'm not the one making a mistake, Sheriff," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You are. And I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The sheriff took another step toward her, his face inches from hers. The anger radiated off him like a wave. His breath smelled of cigarette smoke, and his eyes were wide, pupils dilated with rage. "You think this is going to end well for you? You think you're going to get away with this?" "I'm not afraid of you," Emma said, her voice trembling but resolute. She held her phone up, keeping the camera steady as he glared at her, his face contorting with a mix of anger and disbelief. "I'm going to make sure everyone sees who you really are." The sheriff's jaw clenched. He was seething now, his hand tightening around the handle of his holster. But Emma didn't flinch. She had crossed a line, and she knew there was no going back. For better or worse, she had made her choice. "Let's see how that plays out for you," Sheriff Martin growled. He turned on his heel, storming off toward his patrol car without another word. But Emma didn't lower the phone. She kept it trained on him, capturing every step, every move. She wasn't about to let this man intimidate her or her children any longer. She wasn't about to let anyone get away with treating her like she was invisible. As the sheriff climbed into his car and drove off, Emma stood frozen for a moment, her heart still racing in her chest. She wasn't sure if she had done the right thing, but she knew that it was the only thing she could have done. And as the seconds ticked by, a feeling of quiet triumph washed over her. She had stood up for herself. She had stood up for her children. But little did she know, the video she had just recorded would become the spark that ignited something far bigger than anyone in Brooksville had ever imagined. The consequences of this moment would ripple through the entire town, and through her life, in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Emma turned to Jack and Lily, their faces still pale, their eyes wide. Jack's voice trembled as he asked, "Mom, is he gone? Is everything okay?" Emma smiled down at them, trying to reassure them, though her mind was racing. "Yeah, sweetie. It's okay. We're safe." But deep down, Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same. The quiet life she had built for her family had just been shattered. And what followed, what was to come in the next few minutes, would change everything. The video was already being shared. People would see it. People would talk. And Sheriff Martin's life, his career, his reputation, was hanging by a thread, ready to unravel in front of the entire world. As Emma stood there, holding her phone, the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in. Her hand shook slightly, but she refused to let go of the device. She watched as Sheriff Martin's patrol car drove off, his taillights disappearing into the distance. For a moment, everything felt still. There was no immediate rush, no sense of urgency, just the quiet sound of her children's breathing and the distant hum of the town's life continuing on. It was surreal, almost as if time had paused just for her, but she knew that the calm she felt was fleeting. Something had shifted, something that could never be undone. She lowered her phone and turned toward Jack and Lily. They were standing close to her now, both looking up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Jack, the younger of the two, tugged at the sleeve of her jacket. "Mom, is he really gone?" he asked, his voice small and trembling. Emma bent down to their level, placing a reassuring hand on Jack's shoulder. "Yes, sweetie, he's gone. Everything's okay now." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her mind. Was everything really okay? She had stood up for herself, for her children, but at what cost? The sheriff had been furious, his threats hanging in the air like poison. She couldn't help but wonder what might come next. But the fear that lingered in the pit of her stomach wasn't for herself. It was for her kids. They had seen it all. They had witnessed a moment of escalation, something that was beyond their understanding. And now they had questions she wasn't sure she had answers for. The weight of it all pressed on her chest, and she did her best to hide the concern in her eyes. "Let's go home, okay?" she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Jack and Lily nodded, but Emma could tell they weren't convinced. They hadn't seen their mother like this before. To them, she was their protector, strong, always in control. Today, for the first time, they had seen her face to face with something that was beyond her control. As they walked toward the car, Emma's thoughts raced. She glanced back at the park, still empty except for the rustling trees and the echoes of children's laughter that seemed so distant now. Her hand went to her phone again, and she checked the screen. The video was still there, a small dark thumbnail that felt like a ticking time bomb in her palm. She had filmed everything. The sheriff's threats, the way his body language had shifted when she'd stood her ground, the moment he'd turned and stormed off, furious. She couldn't help but wonder if the video was the right decision. Had she made a mistake? Or had she done exactly what needed to be done? As Emma started the car and pulled away from the park, she could already feel a shift in the world around her. She had no way of knowing it yet, but the video would soon be seen by thousands of people, shared across social media, picked up by local news stations, and spread through the small town like wildfire. What had felt like a small, personal confrontation was about to become something much larger. It was the kind of thing that could ignite a spark, the kind of thing that could tear down walls and expose the truth in ways no one had ever expected. Back at home, Emma tried to settle her mind. She tucked Jack and Lily into bed, reading them their favorite bedtime story, though her voice was distant. She couldn't shake the events of the day. As she kissed them good night, her thoughts lingered on the sheriff. He was a man of power, and power had a way of making people believe they were invincible. But Sheriff Martin had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated her, and now, because of that video, there would be no way to hide from the truth. Emma couldn't sleep. She paced back and forth in her living room, her phone in hand, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that her phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. She looked down, her heart jumping into her throat. A notification from a local news outlet. The headline read, "Sheriff threatens local mother in park. Video sparks outrage." The article was short but powerful, and it linked to the video Emma had posted. She felt a strange mix of dread and relief. This was it, the moment when everything changed. As the day wore on, the video spread faster than Emma could have imagined. People in the town were talking. Friends, neighbors, even strangers from across the state started to weigh in. Some were outraged, calling for accountability, demanding that Sheriff Martin face the consequences of his actions. Others defended him, questioning the context of the video and whether it was being blown out of proportion. But no one could deny the way Martin had spoken to her, the threat in his voice, the aggressive posture. Emma didn't know it yet, but her phone was about to light up with calls, messages, and notifications. The town was divided. Some rallied behind her, supporting her decision to speak up, while others were skeptical, asking why she hadn't simply walked away or avoided confrontation. But regardless of the opinions swirling around her, Emma knew one thing for certain: there was no going back now. By the time the local news broadcast aired the story, Emma's name was already being spoken in hushed tones across Brooksville. Her face appeared on the screen, her expression determined and unwavering. The footage of the confrontation played in the background, showing the sheriff's menacing words, the intensity of the moment. It was all there, every detail captured in real time. Sheriff Martin's phone rang off the hook, his colleagues questioning his actions, local officials asking for explanations. In the span of just a few hours, the sheriff's career, his life's work, began to unravel. The small-town sheriff, who had once been a symbol of authority and power, was now a target. The video had done its job. The truth was out there, and there was no way to hide it. As Emma sat in her living room, staring at the screen, her emotions were a mix of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, for her children. But the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Sheriff Martin's fate now rested in the hands of a public that was growing increasingly outraged. And Emma knew that whatever happened next would change her life, and the life of her community, forever. The sheriff's career was on the line, but Emma's fight for justice was just beginning. And the morning after the video went viral, Emma woke to an overwhelming flood of messages, calls, and notifications. Her phone buzzed incessantly, a never-ending stream of updates from social media, local news outlets, and friends. Some messages were full of support, telling her she had done the right thing, while others were less kind, questioning her motives and accusing her of stirring up trouble. But it didn't matter. The sheriff had been exposed. His career was now hanging by a thread. As Emma scrolled through the comments on social media, she saw her face, her children's faces, plastered across news websites, the footage replaying on loop in the background. In every corner of the internet, people were talking about the confrontation, debating the sheriff's behavior and whether Emma had been justified in recording the incident. Some local residents defended Martin, claiming that his actions were within reason, while others were appalled by his aggression. The once stable town of Brooksville was divided. People were taking sides, and opinions were pouring in from all corners of the state. The local news station had picked up the story, with a segment dedicated to the event and its aftermath. Emma watched, heart racing, as the footage aired again, the sheriff's menacing threats replaying on the screen. The anchors analyzed the situation, the moral implications of her decision, and the legal consequences for Martin. A few legal experts weighed in, suggesting that the sheriff's behavior could constitute harassment or abuse of power. A few more hours passed, and it became clear Sheriff Martin was under intense scrutiny. By mid-morning, Emma received a call from a local reporter asking for an interview. She agreed, though her stomach churned at the thought of facing the media. She hadn't signed up for this. All she had wanted was a peaceful afternoon in the park with her kids. But now, she was thrust into a public battle, the weight of her decision bearing down on her like a storm. As the reporter arrived at her doorstep, Emma stood in her living room, looking out the window at the quiet street outside. Her world had shifted overnight. She wasn't sure what to expect from the interview, but one thing was clear. She was going to tell her side of the story, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. The reporter set up his camera and began asking her questions. Emma spoke honestly, describing the events in the park, the sheriff's threats, the escalating tension, and the moment she decided to record. She explained that she hadn't wanted to make a scene, but the sheriff's aggressive behavior had left her with no choice. She was calm, measured in her responses, but as she spoke, a part of her still felt like she was reliving the incident. Every word she said seemed to pull her back into that moment, back into the park, facing down a man who was supposed to serve and protect, but instead had used his power to intimidate her. While Emma spoke to the reporter, Sheriff Martin was facing a very different reality. News of the confrontation had spread across town, and the local authorities were now looking into his actions. He had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but it was clear that his career was in jeopardy. Sheriff Martin wasn't used to being questioned. He was a man who had built his career on respect, on fear. He had been the enforcer of the law in Brooksville for years, trusted by his peers, feared by those who crossed him. But now his actions were under a microscope, and he was finding it difficult to defend himself. The video was irrefutable. His threats were clear, his tone unmistakable. There was no hiding behind the badge this time. As the investigation continued, Martin's past began to surface. Old colleagues spoke out, recalling moments when the sheriff had overstepped his bounds, using his authority to push people around. It became evident that this wasn't an isolated incident. His behavior had been simmering for years, and now, thanks to Emma's video, it was all coming to light. Back in her living room, Emma's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a local politician. The message was brief but pointed. "You did the right thing. You've shaken things up around here, and change is coming." Emma read the message twice, unsure what to make of it. Change. What kind of change? She knew that the conversation about the sheriff was just the beginning. The way people viewed law enforcement in Brooksville was about to shift. The community would have to confront its biases, its assumptions, and its trust in the systems that governed them. And it wasn't just about the sheriff anymore. It was about something much bigger. Throughout the day, the town buzzed with activity. Conversations were held in coffee shops, on street corners, in living rooms. People were talking, questioning, analyzing what had happened. Some believed that Emma had done the right thing, that she had exposed an injustice. Others, however, felt uncomfortable with the way the situation had unfolded. They didn't want to believe that one of their own, someone they had trusted, could behave in such a way. Some questioned whether Emma had overreacted, asking why she didn't simply walk away when the sheriff first approached. But no matter what side people were on, one thing was certain. The sheriff's actions had cast a long shadow over the community. His reputation was shattered. He had been a figure of authority for so long, but now he was just another man under investigation, his power slipping away with every passing moment. As the sun set that evening, Emma sat in her kitchen, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected any of this to happen. She hadn't wanted it to. All she had wanted was a peaceful afternoon with her children. But as she sat there, looking out the window at the town she had lived in her whole life, she knew that things had changed forever. The phone rang again, interrupting her thoughts. It was her lawyer, informing her that the town council was meeting the next morning to discuss the situation. The sheriff was facing an internal investigation, and there was talk of possible criminal charges. Emma's heart skipped a beat. This was real. This was no longer just about a single incident in a park. It was about justice, accountability, and the power of standing up for what was right. The fallout from that afternoon was far from over. The sheriff's career was in ruins, and his future uncertain. But Emma wasn't finished either. She had ignited a fire in Brooksville, a fire that would force people to confront their own prejudices, to question the systems they had trusted, and to stand up for what was right. The community had been forever changed, and Emma's place in it would never be the same. But one thing was clear. She had started something bigger than herself, something that could not be undone. And as the days passed, she would have to face the consequences of her actions, both good and bad. The road ahead was uncertain, but Emma knew that there was no turning back. The truth had been revealed, and it was only just beginning to unfold. Most shocking part was yet to come. The next 7 minutes would be the most important of all. The following days felt like a blur to Emma. What had started as a simple moment of standing up for herself had snowballed into something she could no longer control. The town of Brooksville was divided, and everywhere she went, people whispered, pointed, and talked. She felt the eyes on her, the weight of public opinion pressing down on her every step. It was both empowering and overwhelming. She had become the focal point of a battle she hadn't chosen, but the truth was out, and there was no going back now. While some people rallied behind her, offering support and praising her courage, others questioned her actions. Some locals saw her as a hero, a woman who had stood up against an unjust abuse of power. But others, especially those who had always admired Sheriff Martin, viewed her as a troublemaker, someone who had blown a minor incident out of proportion. They couldn't see past the sheriff's badge, couldn't separate their trust in him from the reality of what had transpired. The divide in the town was palpable. People who had once been friendly and familiar now crossed the street when they saw her, their faces a mixture of judgment and uncertainty. The sheriff, meanwhile, was in hiding. His reputation had been shattered, his authority questioned. Sheriff Martin was no longer the confident, intimidating figure he had once been. His every move was now scrutinized. His once pristine record was now under the microscope, and a growing number of people began to remember past incidents, small offenses, whispers of cruelty, moments when he had used his power in ways that made people uncomfortable. What had seemed like an isolated outburst now appeared to be part of a larger pattern. Emma knew the road ahead would be difficult. Despite her inner strength, there were moments when doubt crept in. Had she done the right thing? Was standing up to the sheriff worth all of this? Her mind wrestled with the implications. Her children were witnessing everything. Jack, with his innocent questions, and Lily, with her growing awareness of the world's complexities. Emma had wanted to protect them from this, shield them from the ugliness that sometimes crept into society. But she knew that by standing up to the sheriff, she was teaching them something far more valuable. She was showing them what it meant to take a stand when something wasn't right, even when it felt like the world was against you. But the weight of her decision was heavier than she had anticipated. The media frenzy continued to escalate. National news outlets picked up the story, with news anchors discussing the video, analyzing the confrontation, and debating the broader implications of Emma's actions. She had unintentionally become the face of a larger conversation about police conduct, authority, and justice. The pressure on her grew daily, and though she had received messages of support, the onslaught of negativity was just as intense. She received anonymous threats, people telling her that she had made a mistake, that she should have just let it go. The sheriff's supporters flooded her inbox with hateful messages, accusing her of trying to ruin a good man's life. As the investigation into Sheriff Martin's conduct deepened, the town council called for a public meeting. It was supposed to be an opportunity to address the issue head-on, to clear the air and discuss the future of the sheriff's office in Brooksville. Emma had mixed feelings about attending. Part of her wanted to be there, to confront the community and make her case. Another part of her felt like a circus animal, a symbol of something much larger than herself. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the emotional toll it would take. The night of the meeting, Emma dressed in simple clothes, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea what to expect. The meeting room was packed, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. As she walked in, all eyes turned to her. People whispered behind their hands, some nodding in support, others glaring in disdain. She sat quietly in the back, feeling the weight of every stare. The meeting started with a few formalities, but soon the discussion turned to the issue at hand. The town council had gathered to address Sheriff Martin's actions, and the public was eager to share their thoughts. Some spoke in favor of the sheriff, claiming that his years of service outweighed one bad incident. Others, including several members of the local civil rights group, expressed their anger at what had happened in the park. They called for accountability, for justice, and for change in how law enforcement interacted with the community. Then it was Emma's turn. She stood, her hands shaking slightly, her heart hammering in her chest. As she walked to the front of the room, the murmur of conversation died down, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of the moment, the enormity of what she was about to say. The sheriff, sitting in the back of the room, was silent. His once proud face was now an image of defeat, his shoulders hunched as if he had already given up. He looked like a man who knew that his career, and perhaps his entire future, had already been decided. Weeks passed, and the town of Brooksville began to settle into a new rhythm. The immediate shock of the video and the scandal surrounding Sheriff Martin had not fully worn off, but things were slowly starting to change. The investigation into the sheriff's conduct was drawing to a close, and it had become clear that the old guard was being replaced, whether people liked it or not. Emma watched as the town shifted. Conversations at the coffee shop had become more thoughtful, more open. People were starting to talk openly about issues they had never dared to address before: racial bias, power dynamics, and the role of law enforcement in their community. And while not everyone agreed on the solutions, there was a newfound willingness to listen. Emma's role in this change had not gone unnoticed. She had become a symbol of courage, a reluctant hero in a story that had been brewing for years. She had sparked something in Brooksville, a spark that was now lighting the way for a broader conversation about justice and accountability. It wasn't easy for her to accept this new role. She had always been a quiet part of the town, someone who kept her head down and focused on raising her children, doing her work, and staying out of trouble. Now she found herself at the center of a movement that she hadn't asked for but had fully embraced. The pressure hadn't let up, though. Emma was still receiving messages, both supportive and hostile. Some people praised her for her bravery, while others criticized her for disrupting the town's peace. It was the latter that stung the most. Emma wasn't someone who liked conflict. She didn't seek out trouble. But when the sheriff had threatened her and her children in that park, something inside her had snapped. She couldn't sit back and let injustice stand, no matter the cost. She had never imagined that her decision would result in such a huge shift in her life, but now she understood why it was so necessary. Change didn't happen on its own. It had to be fought for. As the days wore on, Emma began to feel a shift within herself. The weight of public scrutiny was exhausting, but she had started to find peace in her own conviction. She knew that she had made the right choice, even when it was the hardest thing she had ever done. But it wasn't just the sheriff who had to face the consequences of his actions. Emma had changed too. She was no longer the woman who kept her head down and stayed out of the spotlight. She had found her voice in a way she hadn't expected, and it had transformed her into someone who could no longer be silenced. One afternoon, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from the mayor of Brooksville. "I've been following the developments closely," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's been happening in this town, about how we can move forward. I'd like to meet with you." Emma was taken aback. The mayor had been relatively silent throughout the controversy, but now he was reaching out to her. It was a pivotal moment, one that could open doors for her or shut them completely. But she didn't hesitate. She agreed to meet. The mayor's office was small but elegant, with polished wood furniture and an air of professionalism. When Emma entered, the mayor rose from his desk and extended his hand. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair, his suit pressed and neat. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I want you to know that I've been following everything, and I think you've done something incredibly important. You've made people see the truth about the sheriff's actions." Emma wasn't sure how to respond. She had expected him to be more defensive, more reluctant to acknowledge the depth of the problem. But the mayor seemed to be genuinely interested in moving forward. "We're having meetings with the community to discuss changes to law enforcement practices," he continued, "and we'd like you to be involved." The words were almost too much to process. Emma had been thinking about this moment, wondering what the future would hold for her and her community. But now that it was here, she was both excited and nervous. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had simply wanted to do the right thing. But now, she realized that her actions had opened doors for change that could affect everyone in Brooksville. "I'm just one person," Emma said, her voice hesitant. "I don't know if I'm the right one to be leading any discussions." The mayor smiled gently. "You've already led, whether you realize it or not. Your courage has sparked this conversation. People are talking now, Emma. They're questioning things that have gone unchallenged for too long. That's a powerful thing." Emma didn't know if she was ready to step into this role, But she knew that it was a responsibility she couldn't ignore. She had made the decision to stand up for what was right, and now she had the chance to help shape the future. The mayor continued, outlining plans for a community forum, a series of discussions aimed at improving the relationship between law enforcement and the people they served. It was a step toward healing, a chance to make sure something like this never happened again. Over the next few weeks, Emma became more involved in these discussions. She attended town hall meetings, participated in panels with local leaders, and spoke to the media, all the while keeping her focus on what mattered most, making sure that the community's voice was heard and that the lessons learned from this painful experience weren't forgotten. She wasn't doing it for fame or recognition or any other reason than the fact that she had a chance to create real, lasting change. The sheriff's hearing was scheduled a few weeks later. As the investigation into his conduct unfolded, more details emerged, and it became clear that his actions had been part of a much larger pattern of misconduct. The community learned that many incidents, including Emma's confrontation, had been swept under the rug for years. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that Sheriff Martin's time in Brooksville was over. The decision was made official. He would be fired, and his name would be removed from the department's records. Emma wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, she felt vindicated, knowing that the truth had come out and that justice had been served. On the other hand, she knew that the consequences for Martin were just the beginning. There were deeper issues at play here, issues that wouldn't be solved with one man's dismissal. The town had a lot of work to do, and Emma was ready to help. In the weeks that followed, Brooksville began to slowly heal. The town's residents, despite their differences, started to come together to address the problems that had been exposed. People began to talk more openly about race, about power, about privilege. The town's leadership began to implement reforms in the police department, and slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild. For Emma, the road had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative. She had found strength she didn't know she had. She had sparked a change in her community that would endure long after the dust had settled. And as she sat with her children one evening, watching them play in the yard, she realized that this was the legacy she had created, one of courage, of standing up for what's right, even when the consequences were unclear. She had taught her children that their voices mattered. She had taught them that, even when the world was heavy, standing tall was always the right choice. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt at peace. She had done what she had set out to do. She had changed the world for the better, one courageous step at a time. Emma took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't want to be here," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "I didn't want any of this. All I wanted was to spend a normal afternoon with my kids. But what happened to me that day, what happened in that park, isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about whether we stand by when we see something wrong, or whether we speak up, even when it's difficult." She paused, trying to steady herself. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm not going to back down. And I want my kids to grow up in a town where they know they can stand up for what's right, no matter how scary it is." The room was quiet. For a moment, Emma thought she might have lost them. But then, a few people in the audience began to clap. Slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm. The applause rippled through the room, and for the first time in days, Emma felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't the only one who believed that standing up for what was right mattered. The next few days were a whirlwind. The investigation into Sheriff Martin intensified. He was eventually suspended without pay, pending further review. The local law enforcement department conducted a thorough investigation, and in the coming weeks, it was revealed that the sheriff had a history of inappropriate behavior and complaints from citizens that had been ignored or swept under the rug. Emma's bravery in recording the incident had exposed a pattern of misconduct, and it became clear that Sheriff Martin's days as a public servant were numbered. The fallout was not limited to Sheriff Martin. It forced the town to confront deeper issues about race, power, and accountability. Emma's actions had sparked a larger conversation, one that many people had been unwilling to have. There were protests in the streets, rallies demanding justice, and calls for reform in the way law enforcement interacted with the community. The town of Brooksville, once small and quiet, was now at the center of a debate that stretched far beyond its borders. For Emma, the journey was just beginning. The emotional toll had been immense, but she knew that what she had done was important. She had changed the conversation, and in doing so, she had shown her children the power of standing up for what's right, even when the consequences were uncertain. The sheriff's career had ended, but Emma's journey was far from over. She had become a symbol of courage, and as the town of Brooksville began to rebuild and reflect, Emma stood at the center of it all, knowing that the future would never be the same. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she had made a difference, and that was a legacy worth fighting for.